inside the Parisi Palace, high above 3733 East Broadway. This is the Jake Feinberg Show, coming to you on Power Talk. Please go to our website, powertalk.live, download our free app, and stream all of our live local programming, including Solomon on Blast, the Jim Parisi Show, and yours truly, the Jake Feinberg Show. We can't thank you enough for making us part of your day today, and without further ado, I want to bring in an artist who has been creating on his palette for the last half century. He's always been interested in sonic expansion and consciousness expansion through music. And he's mainly well known as a hardware guy, as a guy who's built rigs for cats like John Cipollina and orchestrating the sound and the engineering of the band known as the Grateful Dead. But he's actually also a mercurial musician in his own right. And we just listened to a clip of a cosmic band that he was in. Just a lot to get to today. High honor. Dan Healy, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Hey, Jake. Good to be here.
It's so great to hang with you, man. Such an honor. You know, I just want to ask you straight off if you could talk a little bit about your experience with Neal Cassady and the beat poets of that time in the Bay Area, Ferlinghetti, and how that they shaped your point of view as related to constantly organic, spontaneous, new creation.
Well, that sort of gets into the politics of the whole San Francisco music movement, which is an interesting concept or an interesting conversation all in itself. I of course, knew all of those guys and hung out, and we all took LSD together and did all, hung out. But for the most part, the circles that I ran in were really more concentrated in the musical aspects of it. So there were a group of us that mostly became the bands that were really found ourselves running into each other in some kind of magic cataclysm in the early 1960s in the Haight-Ashbury that had all come from various walks of life around the country, but had one sort of interest in common, and that was music, and in my case, music and sound, and how the two could go together. You got to remember that prior to that, there was no connection between live concert sound and the actual music. The sound systems were called public address systems. You could hear Elvis singing over some squawky speaker somewhere with no microphones anywhere on any of the instruments or anything. So that was where it was when I started. And so it was me and the ones like me that sort of conceived, or for me, I'm not going to really only speak for myself, although I know a lot of my friends felt the same way, that I heard the music in my head along with everybody else. I came from a musician background, so I was really a musician before I was into sound and recording and stuff. But I noticed right away, one of the very first things I noticed was that I hearing the music and then hearing the way it actually came out in terms of audience concerts or even on records and stuff, there was like a huge disparity. And I've discovered that way from in front that I had the ability to translate the music that from in our heads into the actual physical mechanics of the equipment. And in the day, it was pretty crude, but as the years went by, of course, that was part of the evolution of the music, was the evolution of the techniques and the equipment and stuff. But so I kind of wound up spending my life, instead of the original intention, which was playing music, spending my life kind of helping other people play music and helping the audience hear the music that we were actually hearing in our heads. I think Jerry Garcia probably was the guy that really got me to do that, because he was the first one that recognized that I had been given a gift of the ability to translate into the equipment the emotions and the thoughts and the sounds of our music. So he was the first one to challenge me to get involved in that side of it. But it also was interesting and a lot of fun, and I just went forward in it. I started in a recording studio. I started in 1963. I got a job in a recording studio in San Francisco called Commercial Recorders. And the guy that owned it, there are two guys that owned it, Lloyd Pratt and Steve Atkins. Lloyd Pratt was a bass player, and he played in a group in the World War II 1940s cabaret group called the Page Cavanaugh Trio, and he was a bass player.
Right.
And Downbeat magazine, which was really a famous production back in those, he was Downbeat Jazz magazine bass player of the year for 2 years in a row, 53 I think and 54.
Really?
Around in there.
Was he playing? He was playing. Yeah. He was playing like bebop in a trio setting, or what was it? I mean, this is fascinating.
No, he was playing. I guess you would say he was playing sort of lounge music of the 40s. So that would be like kind of the Benny Goodman trio version of the Benny Goodman Orchestra. So a lot of the guys played the orchestrations, but because it was a trio or a quartet, it was a smaller group, but the same songs and that sort of thing. So he played that kind of music. Okay.
Yes.
And so he gave me a job as a janitor in the recording studio in his studio, and I literally vacuumed the place and cleaned the shitters and stuff. But it gave me a chance because this was before the days of internships or any of that concept. And they're also in colleges and schools and stuff didn't offer any recording. The only place you could really learn about recording and sound would be if you were in the military. Then they had what they called the Signal Corps, and that was pretty much it. So I got a chance to hang out in the studio, and I did. And eventually the day came when, and by 1965, 64 and 65, the record companies were sending emissaries to San Francisco to scout, as talent scouts, to find bands to sign. And so this studio worked 5 days a week. It was Commercial Recorders was the name, and it made commercials only. It made jingles and stuff like that. And in those days, there weren't national commercial spots. The San Francisco radio stations played commercials that were made in San Francisco, L.A. and L.A., New York, and so on and so forth, Chicago. So it wasn't nationwide like it is now. It was very local. And so this studio produced most all the commercials. It was a very popular place. And on the weekends, it was dark. So the record company people wanted to buy blocks of time on the weekend to bring bands in and do what they called in those days demo tapes. And so the principals didn't want to work on the weekends, so they said, "Hey, kid, here's your chance. You can be the engineer, and we'll sell blocks of time to the record companies, and you can run these bands through."
Wow.
And so that's literally how I started recording and got my first job actually twisting knobs and learning all that stuff. I mean, I was always a freak for all of that stuff, so I always knew pretty much how it worked. But that was the first time I was really being paid for actually doing it.
No, this
and
is.
then from
this
then
is
on,
I want to just because you're riffing,
sure,
you're on fire.
Sure.
But I want when I interviewed Marty Ballin, I just want to go back to the. I've interviewed a lot of the pranksters, and like Ballin was talking about the King and Queen of Reno in his basement when he was a teenager, performing with a black jazz band down there. And I guess what I wanted to ask you really simply, like, I know you became obsessed with sonic expansion. Garcia challenged you, and eventually, the work, you had to sing for your supper, so you obviously became an engineer. But the thing is that I just was wondering if you could talk about what those cats, the Ferlinghettis, the Ginsbergs, the Kerouacs, those pranks.
What is it that you were asking about him?
What I'm trying to ask.
What is it that you want to hear?
Well, because their adherence to being an individual. We live in a very formulaic time now. We live in a time where it's cool to sound like other people. Okay. Before it was, no, you have to be different. In fact, if people came up to you and said, "Hey, you sounded like this person," you'd want to slit your wrists.
That was an insult.
Exactly. So I'm trying to get at this idea of how much those guys emboldened you as a musician and your peers to finding your own individual sound and voice, because we're living through a time right now where it's much more popular to be comping other peeps.
Yeah. Actually, none. Okay.
Okay. Good. No,
all right, that's the blunt answer. but let me just tell you. Okay.
Break it down.
More honestly, we kind of we were on our own trip. We were sort of, you've heard the phrase "rebel without a cause." We were rebels with a cause.
And what was the cause? What was the cause?
And our cause was music. Mm-hmm. All right, and we wanted to express ourselves musically. We had grown up listening to our parents listen to big band music, and then in the 50s, late 40s and all through the 50s was bebop and rock and roll and Bill Healey and the Comets and Chuck Berry and that kind of stuff. And when we got into psychedelic drugs, and if you mix psychedelic drugs with electric guitars, a whole other thing begins to happen. And a sufficient number of us heard the possibilities, and that was the difference, and that's what we pursued. For me, the sort of bebop poets, Ferlinghettis and all of those guys, Ginsberg and all those guys, they were like 50s beatnik kind of guys, and so they were 10 or more years older than us. So they played their role, but their role was more in the politics and stuff. They wanted to their goal was to change society. Our goal was to play music, though they dovetailed because we shared the same audience. If you get a few petulant teenagers together, they're petulant teenagers. If you get enough together, you can call it a movement. And so a lot of that was conscripted. A lot of the energy of the youth that followed the whatever it was that attracted people to the city, people began to conscript it and use it for various other things. So there were movements that had involved politics. There's movements that involved society. There were movements that just were mechanical and musical and had only to do with the field of the arts. The poster people, the Mouse and Kelly, all of those guys, Moscoso,
exactly.
George Hunter,
yeah.
All those guys, they were. That was a whole other version of self-expression. Now, it was clearly based on psychedelic drugs. Stanley Mouse pinstriped cars in the late 50s and early 60s. It used to be really popular if you had a hot rod to have flame jobs, okay? So that's what those guys did. And then when this all began to happen, they got involved in making posters and did what has now become fantastically famous art. And so that was kind of what they did. We kind of did music. So there were a whole bunch of people, but we coexisted in the same sort of area and the same place. And some of our experiences overlapped each other's so far as the government and the law and some of the things. In our case, in the music case, we were always up against we were always in trouble because of something we were doing in the audience. All right, we were either playing music too late or too early, right, or not too loud or not loud enough, or in the wrong place, or drawing people here or blocking a street there. And so that was always a contention. And for a while, it got to be the cops versus us. And that's where all of that fuck the band stuff and tear down the walls stuff came from. But unfortunately, a lot of that ended in throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I'm not sure, as I look back over it, how much of the rebellion was just for the sake of rebelling and how much of it was really a message. But that's up for each and every person to decide. That's my version.
Absolutely, and that's. I mean, I only want the Dan Healy version. I'm not interested in some sort of declarative statement. I have a belief though, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong. Were you getting off? I mean, you were a bass player originally, and I wanted you to talk about. I mean, were you getting off on Mingus? Was there seminal live performances where you saw, or Scotty LaFaro? Because in the early '60s, the call and response between Scotty and Bill Evans was hypnotic, and I'm like, I bet Healy. I mean, ultimately, you look at Healy Treese, and you have such a deep bag of tunes, and a lot of the tunes are R&B and rock tunes. It's not like you're playing jazz, but I feel like you were enamored by the jazzers, and I'd like you to talk about your influences on bass.
Yeah, I was. You're absolutely right. You read it. You read me just right.
I felt that. Yeah.
Bill Evans is one of my absolute idols.
Right.
George Shearing was a fantastic piano player that I just idolized.
Killer.
A lot of people, even I started out listening to Art Tatum. Have you ever listened to Art Tatum?
All the time.
I mean, yeah, Art Tatum gives me goosebumps just to think about him. You know, he was a genius and a fantastic player. So those are the people that I was really enamored of and really was blown away by. And so when I started playing, plus my parents are both musicians, and my grandfather was a musician. So I kind of came from a musical family. I can remember being so young, sitting on the piano bench next to my mother, where my feet wouldn't touch the floor, and her band would be rehearsing in our living room. Okay, so that's my background. So like I said, I started out as a musician. I didn't start out as being a producer and engineer and stuff. But anyway, yeah, the background for me was that. And Richard Treese, bless his heart and rest his soul, a fabulous singer and player. He had a lot of the R&B in him, and the Bicycle was headed into a great place. We were just branching into jazz. I have tapes of us playing jazz stuff that I don't think are floating around.
Are you serious? In 65? 65, roughly, in that range?
Yeah. No, that was more like 68.
Okay, I just want to go back for a second. This is the important thing, because I know Bill Evans. I'm thinking about the bass as an individual voice in itself. I mean, there was were you doing the upright? Were you trying to play to those records of those early '60s upright bass players? Because it was really at that point when I interviewed Miroslav Vicious. You know, a lot of people say in Weather Report he was like one of the guys that first Stanley Clarke. They had the bass was an individual.
I would have to agree with that.
You know, but early '60s, I'm like, was Healy's ears growing listening to these guys playing? Not just keeping time on, not just locking the groove, but playing their own voice.
I can't really take credit for that. For me, playing bass was I wanted to. I heard a more driving. I'm more of a driving bass player. If you listen to old Bicycle tapes, I'm like sort of a driving bass player. So I'm not. I wouldn't call myself that much of an expressive bass player, not like so many of the really great players are.
Right.
But I because I was the groove. It was all about the groove for me, and I got off. We had a drummer, Butch Giannini, who unfortunately had a heart attack and died. We were playing at the Whiskey A Go Go in Hollywood.
Wow.
And we had a 5-night stand there.
Wow.
And we were. After the third night, he had a heart attack and died. He was probably the most fantastic drummer I've ever known in my life. And him and Richard Treese and I were really the Bicycle. And then we had Stephen Fisk, who was our sort of songwriter and singer, although we all wrote songs. And then we had a guy named Al Rose, who was a really good keyboard. He played Hammond organ and electric piano. And that was the Bicycle. And we had a really cooking little band. And after Butch died, I was so devastated. I went back into the studio and started and did producing other people and stuff like that. But at that time, we were really headed out there, and we broke into playing jazz. That's what we wanted to play. We were trying to fuse together that concept of jazz and kind of rock and rolly, but with keeping it driving and stuff. And also country and western music. I also have a country and western music heritage. So that was all swirling around in my head, and I was sort of into sorting all of that out back in those days. And that's what I was doing.
Well,
so I wasn't really, I can't really take credit for being one of the beginners of some of the styles that became famous.
Well, I just to show you that I've been on this trip for 6 years. I did this interview almost 3 years ago, and I want you to take a listen to this cat talk, and then we'll come back and break it down, okay?
Yeah.
You know, I was hoping for the audience you could go back and talk about how you originally met Dan Healy.
Dan Healy, wow, okay. How did I originally meet Dan? Okay, I met Dan Healy because I was jamming at the Grateful Dead house on Ashford Street. Jerry Garcia and Bobby Weir had been helping me, and I was jamming there at the house, and Danny was the sound man for the Dead. And he was jamming, there was a guitar player there and some other people, and when the Dead took over the Carousel Ballroom, and started running it sort of basically in competition with the Fillmore. After a while, they decided to have a Tuesday jam night. It was Mickey Hart and Jerry Garcia and Jorma Kaukonen and Jack Cassidy. And so, and Mickey had invited me up to hear him play. And the next week, Bobby Weir called and asked me if I would be the drummer. And Danny was the bass player in that. And we went on to form a group called, well, it was originally Hoffman's Bicycle, about Albert Hoffman falling off his bike, but it just became the Bicycle, and we went through all the usual rock and roll painful.
Wait, hold on a second. Healey was playing bass at the Carousel. He was playing bass in the band?
He was playing bass. He had ambitions to be a bass player, and he was playing bass, and that was the Bicycle for a while, and then.
All right, Mr. Healey, who do you think that is?
That's obviously Jim Stern.
It is obviously Jim Stern. 3 years, August 6, 2014, he dropped that story on me. And so that's taken the Bicycle back to earlier than...
1968.
So that's 68. And he's...
Yeah, that's when we had the Carousel Ballroom. 67 and 68.
Could you talk to me and my audience about the... because I read somewhere about the meme troupe. Bill Graham had the meme troupe. Then he took over the Fillmore, and I just don't.
Yeah, he did the meme troupe long before he got into being a rock and roll promoter.
Right, but then he got but can you just talk about how this Carousel Ballroom versus the Fillmore came to be? Because I've done so much research on the Fillmore when it was truly just a Chitlin circuit run by Charles Sullivan before Graham got the gig. I just want you to take us through that.
Yeah, okay, here's what it was. The Fillmore it was owned by a company called the Fillmore Corporation. They had an office down about a block and a half down from the Fillmore on Fillmore Street, from the Fillmore Auditorium, which was Fillmore and Gary. It was a 1940s ballroom, left over from World War II swing time era, and it was largely dark. And you could rent it for $200 a day. In the evening, and it mostly was wedding commencements and graduation commencements and the church socials and that kind of stuff, and so anybody could rent it. A guy named Bobby Collins, who was an entrepreneur that lives in the Haight-Ashbury, he was friends with the Quicksilver messenger service people, and the charlatans. He hung out with all of those guys. Richard Olson and Mike and all of those guys. He would occasionally rent the Fillmore and put on shows there. And that was back in the acid test days.
Right.
And so he would rent it for a night. We would charge $2 at the door to get in, and when the $200 got earned up, everybody else got in free. And it was really a place for us to play our music. And this goes for all the San Francisco groups. And this is early. This is 65, 64, 65, around in there. This was even the Airplane and Grateful Dead. And Grateful Dead had just switched over from being the Warlocks to the Grateful Dead. Wow. And they had nowhere to go, nothing to do and nowhere to go, so to speak. So we began doing shows there, and it got to be pretty. I don't know how much you want. In those days, the concert world was really run by the AM radio stations, Tom Donahue. Absolutely. And those kind of guys, and they had like the Cow Palace and the Shrine Auditorium and places like that. And if you weren't in their clique, you didn't play around town. And the reason that we got the Fillmore is that nobody wanted it. So we really got a place that we could rent that was outside. It was about being different. It was about being outside the structure that had kept us out because they didn't own us, right? And we didn't want it at the time to be owned. And also we were very young, and we were just figuring out what we were going to be and what we were going to do and stuff. So we started having these shows in various places when we discovered that a lot of the halls around you could rent, and they weren't large halls. The Fillmore is not a big place. I remember thinking it was the biggest place in the world, but it's actually teeny compared to big places. But we would rent it, and then eventually what happened is that Graham rented it a couple of times also, and the Meme Troupe did some of their stuff there. And then he sort of got into the promotion thing, and he was a businessman more than anything else. And so he eventually the Fillmore Corporation, instead of dealing with different people every weekend, and then there were squabbles over who got it over any given weekend, because by 1966 it was really popular, and so they finally said the first person that has $5,000 can have a year lease on the place, and guess who had the $5,000? Okay,
Graham did, yeah, that's right. Graham.
So that became Graham's Rock and Roll Hall, and as soon as it did, then he ran everything, and then it was he that decided and picked who got to play and who didn't get to play, and so then it was right back into I understand business and like that. I'm not. It's not a disparagement of anybody. It's just the way it works in that world, and so we once again didn't have a place to play. I had a friend named Furlong who owned a tape recorder. He owned an Ampex 3-track tape recorder, and in those days that was a big deal machine. And so he would rent it to me to record our Grateful Dead, Quicksilver, and Big Brother, and the bands that I did sound for and recorded and stuff. And so I rented a machine once for him, and he said, "Oh, you have to pick it up where I was using it last at a place over a Buick dealership on Market and Van Ness called the Carousel Ballroom." Ah. And none of us even knew it was there. And I went and found this place, and it was just like the Fillmore place. It was owned by the Hibernia Society, which is the League of Irish Voters. Okay. And so we made a deal, and they let us have it, and we took it over and started the Carousel Ballroom, so that once again we had a freedom place to play. So that's kind of what happened to the Fillmore.
It's fascinating. I mean, I'm always curious about also when I talked to Ken Babbs, he said that the Grateful Dead, you had your own at the Longshoremen's Hall.
Longshoremen's Hall.
Can you talk about it?
The Flux Fest.
Yeah, because there's two questions. The Dan Buchla, who also left us, did you have a relationship with that cat?
Don
Buchla. Did because that cat seems to fly. Beaver and Krause, those cats get a lot of the credit, but I think that.
Right.
Can you talk about that cat and his significance to the Bay Area?
Well, no, he was a gyrogearless freak, and he was building like me and a bunch of us, and he was building. His whole thing was synthesizers, synthetic music, and noisemaker, generating noise. I mean, most of us were using guitars and basses and drum sets. He imagined being able to recreate the sound. He and Moog were the guys that sort of they heard in their heads what we were hearing. They were hearing a way to take electronic equipment, and this is way before their time, and make it sound like orchestral instruments, which you can do now readily and easily. But in those days, the wherewithal wasn't there. But nonetheless, they had the dream of it, and they were on that path to do that kind of stuff. And so that's how that was their piece of pie, and that's how they were involved. And naturally, since we were all freaks and all experimenting with this stuff and trying every new idea, nothing was excluded. Nobody's ideas were excluded. It was open and fair game, and that was one of the things that we tried the hardest to maintain was to lay off everybody, leave everybody alone, let everybody do it, live and let live. That was it, and for me to this day, that's still my motto, So that's how those guys got involved, and the Longshoremen's Hall was another place that you could rent. Then they used to, and I'm not sure. I knew some of the principals, but I'm not sure exactly who all was involved in it. But I know that with respect to Babbs and the Longshoremen's Hall, there was a gig that's probably one of the most notorious gigs. You might even call it infamous, but for sure famous gigs in San Francisco, called the Flux Fest. And that was at the Longshoremen's Hall. And that was like the huge turning point between where acid tests which were a fairly small gathering, became sort of the cat got out of the bag, and a larger scale got hip to what was going on, and then that was maybe among the unveiling of the whole larger picture of the entire San Francisco social scene, the Haight-Ashbury social scene, so to speak. So the Flux Fest and the Longshoremen's Hollow is that place. And right after that, the Longshoremen decided not to have too many more shows there because it got out of hand. The Flux Fest was a little bit out of hand. Nobody got hurt or anything, but for that, you got to remember, in that day and age, just being stoned on acid and doing stuff like taking off your clothes at a gig was enough to shock the snot out of the straight society. So that got everybody up in arms, even though there wasn't really any harm. Nothing. One of the nice things about it is none of us was up to harm. Once in a while, people got hurt from being naive and not knowing how to be careful. But there was never any malice. There was never any hatred. There was never any animosity, and there was no room for any of that. And that's probably the part of the whole '60s music scene that I admire and respect the most. And I don't know what's become of that, because we seem to be living in a world of violence now, and violence begetting violence, and a lot of it has to do with some of the presidential administrations. A lot of it has to do with other various aspects of life and politics. But in those days, it was really all for one and one for all, and we managed to live it. So we didn't just talk about it; we lived it.
No, talking to Dan Healy here on the Jake Feinberg Show. I think the word is trust. I mean, you guys had a lot of trust. There was a security. I mean, we glorify violence in our society now. At 39 years old, it's hard to, it's hard to fathom that. And then you have gigs like Altamont that, I don't know if you were present at that gig, but it was like there was carnage.
I did the sound for Altamont.
Right. So it was but I mean, can you talk about, because what I'm saying is there was anarchy to a degree there, but yet it wasn't the anarchy and the violence was not glorified. I think basically it was pretty devastating to Garcia. It was kind of a drag.
Well, it was a big drag, and it was largely from misguided and misapplied politics and misapplied opinions about things. Nobody wants to hear this, but in a very large sense, I think the blood is on Mick Jagger's hands. Okay, that's the way I see it. But he's the one that incited the audience. But it's not as simple as just that, because there were other people there that Let me just preface by saying that there were people that, and I guess it's one of those bummers about society. But there's people that always got to poke the dog with a stick. Okay, there's those kind of people, and they just can't seem to stop themselves from doing that. For the most part, the rest of us are more than happy to just love one another and have a good time and enjoy being there, right? But there's always those one or two people that have to incite and that just can't keep their hands off of things. And there was a guy there that was one of those guys, and one of the things he did is he gave handfuls of tabs of acid to all the Hells Angels. And another misguided thing was asking the Hells Angels to be security guards.
Yeah, right.
That was a big fucking dumb mistake, okay?
And then dose them,
And then dose the shit out of them, and then be surprised that it went run amok? No, sorry. And then it didn't help to have Mick Jagger stand on the stage screaming in the microphone, "You fucking dumb Americans!"
Yeah.
What do you? So it got out of hand, and it was inspired by its own misbehavior. Okay, and that's a shame, because it forever spoiled the fun that we had and the ability for us to congregate without. I mean, it left a mark that to this day makes people skin crawl, mine included, and that's a shame, because that wasn't what we intended to do. So there's an example of what we were doing that got conscripted by some other entity or some other mentality. Okay.
No, yeah, this is true. I also think about going back to Hoffman's Bicycle, the original iterations, even growing up and hearing, I guess it was your mom or your grandma would play in the living room. Is that what you said? I mean, you'd listen to them.
My mom.
Your mom.
My mom.
Can you talk to the audience about how you, Dan Healy? I mean, I think one of the crises that's, of course, I'm not really into pop music, so like younger peeps, I don't necessarily know the music they're listening to, and it's a double-edged sword. But it just seemed to me, whether it was Garcia, or you go back to the Jazzers, everybody had a deep bag of tunes. They knew the American Songbook. They knew all these classic tunes, and then obviously rock was burgeoning. But I just wanted you to talk about how you ultimately developed a big bag of tunes. If you look at those Healy Trees live shows, I mean, it's just like there's like 4 dozen songs on a gig, and it's like you guys. I mean, and I'm trying to figure out today. What my point is today is you throw out to cats today, younger cats. Hey, play this. They don't know it. They don't have a big bag. And I'm like, how did you develop your bag of tunes?
Well, for one thing, there wasn't the internet. There wasn't iPhones. There wasn't any of the multimedia stuff. There was 3 basic television networks, and otherwise that was it. And the TV stations went off at midnight, and so the only thing we really had was radio that we listened to. We all grew up listening to the radio, and jukeboxes, playing music on jukeboxes. But we also had our parents and the heritage. America has the most magnificent heritage of music, dating back 200 years since the beginning. And for some reason, that music was regenerated and retaught, and the songs were hummed, and they called it crossover tunes in those days. So there would be like Hank Williams would write a country and western song, Rags to Riches, that Tony Bennett would sing and have what they call the crossover hit. So there was a melding of music and an overall sense that the different styles of music were equally valid and equally had a point and had a heritage and a home and a place that they come from. So in my case, and I think, and I've talked to Garcia about that. We've rapped about that before, and we had largely the same kind of thing because his dad was a musician too in the 40s. Okay. And so we grew up listening to our parents' music, and then after that, where I lived, my mom played big band music and stuff like that, but the area that we lived in was largely country and western, so a lot of people adhered to that music. And in case of Garcia, he was a bluegrass guy. He grew up on bluegrass music. But all of those backgrounds are all songs that I think if you learn songs when you're young or you hear songs, you're influenced it, and then you get older and you realize, hey, shit, I could do that song myself. Now that's what happened to me. Mm-hmm. So today, if I sit down with my guitar, I play songs from 40s all the way up to heavy metal. And it's just because of the whole sense that all music is all belongs together.
A very special day. Upon this glorious occasion, it's our sound mixer, Mr. Dan Healy's birthday. Now we can't let an occasion like this go by without making our great Healy special. So, on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you.
Reverend Lenny Hart stole a lot of money, and then, or that's at least the story. And then, Sam Cutler had the band, getting their chops up. They played hundreds of shows, then went to Europe, and all of a sudden they started making some dough. They had a lot of money, and they could have gone off and bought their ranches and their cars, and they could have just, spoiled themselves. But instead, they gave you and Owsley $1.5 million to build the wall of sound. And I wanted,
yeah, pretty much.
Can you talk about like the idea of where, because a lot of this stuff there was no written contract. So could you just take us through the story of basically saying how the band said this is yours, and then ultimately how you and Owsley went out and found the materials and the equipment, where you got it from to build the wall of sound?
Well, what I talked about earlier about the early days in the San Francisco music scene and hanging out in the Haight-Ashbury, where everybody's ideas were welcome, and we tried to leave everybody alone and let everybody manifest their dreams and ideas, and in fact, everybody. The Grateful Dead carried that on after the bean counters sort of got involved in other areas and in other bands and in other situations. The record companies, bands signed with record companies and that sort of thing, publicity freaks, lawyers, and all of that. And all of a sudden, everything got a tight asshole. Okay.
Yeah, right.
So, I think I would have to credit Jerry Garcia. He is the one that single-handedly put his foot down and kept the door open for creativity and kept the bean counter and the legal beagles and all of that stuff at bay. It's true, the Grateful Dead suffered more than there was a number of people that took money from the Grateful Dead. It wasn't just Mickey's dad. It was a guy named Ron Rackout took us down for a bunch of money.
That's right. That's right. You're right.
Cutler was not good for the Grateful Dead. So it took a long time to get past that, and we suffered nearly fatal blows. The only thing we had is we had our music, and we had the confidence and inside our hearts that we knew what we wanted to do, and that nothing would stop us, and so we went forward. When the sound, when in the late 60s, early 70s, we had basically used the sound equipment that was designed for talking movies in the mid 1920s. Okay, and we had hot rodded it, and it was spiffier looking, but the actual theoretical designs and stuff were really based on Bell Labs and a company called Western Electric and RCA that did the original research and development of high-quality music sound systems for talking movies. So that was financed by the movie industry.
Wow.
By 1970, we had milked every drop of innovation out of those old principles and ideas, and so it became time to take a departure. And that's where guys like John Mayer got involved. John Curl and a number of other guys, Ron Wickersham, and a number of other people who were designers and mathematicians and stuff like that. And it really became a matter of scrapping everything that we know and start all over again. And so Garcia understood that. And so we proposed to build the Wall of Sound, which was to be an experimental lab. We called it a breadboard, which is lifted from an old radio phrase from making experimental radios and stuff like that. And the object was that it could be configured in any conceivable way. So we broke it all down into individual pieces, and then when you went to play a show, we could configure it in any fashion that we wanted. And also, it was another thing that dovetailed into that was, for the first time ever, designing the sound system to match the venue you're in. So if you're in an old theater, it looks one way. If you're in a big that had ever been done. This is all way over the heads of the manufacturers, and the manufacturers, JBL and Altec and all of those companies, we went to them and asked them to get involved, and their attitude pretty much was, fuck you, we're selling shit faster than we can make it, so why would we want to change any of this? And they didn't know it, but they were tolling their own death knell, but at the time they couldn't see that. So we just said, okay. And we went on our own and started designing equipment, and that's where Crown amps came from, and that's where all Dave Blackmer, all the DBX, all of the people, all saw that it was time to take a departure, and so a whole renaissance happened, starting in like 1970, and by 74, the Wall of Sound was up and running and playing. It was a fantastic, incredible scene, and anybody that ever had a chance to witness it that's a once-in-a-lifetime event. It was and wasn't great. I mean, there were a whole lot of problems with it, but the one thing it did do is it proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that it was time to go forward and time to adopt new ideas and time to stop holding on to the history and to get with new stuff. And it worked, and it proved its point, and then from then on, the rest is, as they say, history.
Being that Garcia, David Nelson, who told me an epic story about in like '65, sitting behind the stacks of the Grateful Dead show, the amps, and with Steve Parrish, and literally the Dead were playing. I guess at that point they would take one song and a real improvisational and stretch it out. And he was like, Steve, look, they're leaving in droves. They're leaving in droves. Like you'd have the audience just leaving because it was so foreign, And eventually people would say, producers or promoters would say, hey Jerry, can you just play this song because it's really popular, man. It's a pop tune. People are gonna get it. And Jerry would say, what's the point? What good is it for? What good is it? Forget it. Why do I do it? So I understand that he was the avatar of sorts to put his foot down. But could you explain how after Rakow, the Reverend Cutler, whoever else, these shysters who over and over ripped the band off, still when the band was less than 10 years together, how did Jerry convince them to say, this is still the path we need to go on, even though they were getting ripped off?
Well, first of all, it was probably the audience saw Nelson and said, fuck this, I'm out of here.
Fuck Nelson, man.
No, I'm just kidding.
No, I know. Love Nelson, dude.
The music was... let me just tell you that none of us ever expected this to go anywhere. We thought that tomorrow it's all going to blow up.
Right,
okay,
right.
None of us ever dreamt. First of all, nobody ever thought they were going to live to be over 30. All right, and so none of us, and we all just assumed that we would ride it until it stopped. And so, with that as the sort of basic premise. It did one thing, it kept it fresh because there wasn't any reason to cling on to anything because none of us gave a shit whether it lasted or not. So playing old songs and preserving this or trying to cling to something or try to draw an audience, nobody cared. I mean, we were going for it. It was all in. And so when you're in an all-in situation, you don't look back. It doesn't really matter what anybody thinks. And that might have been true to a degree, but eventually it became eventually when we got to learn how to play well enough that our music wasn't just a bunch of noise, but it began to have a little bit interest,
right.
Become a little bit interesting.
Sure.
People started listening, and people heard what we heard in our heads. Through all the various means, we managed to communicate it to the audience, and the audience liked it. I mean, they figured it out and decided to go for it. But to take it back, none of us really expected this to ever come to this point. The fact that we all became legends is something that is beyond my ability to comprehend. Okay, I mean, I just thought, okay, well, day after tomorrow, this is going to blow up in our face, and I'll go get a job in a gas station or something. So, and I think that we all sort of thought that.
Can you just touch on this idea of? I mean, it seems. I've done my fair share of psychedelics, but being that I'm a Gen Xer, and when I talked to Dave Getz from Big Brother, I mean, there was the League for Internal Freedom, which is similar to cannabis clubs now, where if you have a card, you could go in and access Sandoz acid. You get free acid, and you're talking about this idea here. You said before an incredible phrase. You said the combination of guitars and psychedelics produces incredible stuff. And I just was hoping you could go a little bit deeper for the audience, because when I hear specifically the crux of the band, Bobby's rhythm chops improved. Were just he got better and better and better and better. But when I look at who were the true musicians at the beginning, when I listened to the triad of Kreutzmann, Lesh, and Garcia, and I never saw the Grateful Dead ever in my life live, and I got into them late.
Well, you got to remember that Pigpen was one of the best musicians.
I don't want to leave out Penn. I don't want to leave out Penn, but I'm just saying, when you talk about the psychedelics, can you talk about, in your experience, the combination of melting into the music when you had this pure, not the the speeded up or the stuff that I was eating at Boston University in the late 90s. But I mean, when you were talking about melting the guitars and the psychedelics, and how
there was a lot of bad LSD around too.
There was. Okay, well, thank you.
That was right from the very beginning. There was a lot of bad LSD. But when you got a chance to get some really good LSD, it was truly a profound experience. And one of the things I think, it's so difficult to describe and so subjective, it's almost not worth trying to describe. But one of the things that happens is that you get past the mechanics or the physics or the physical reality of what you're trying to play, and you hear it. You hear it the way it was intended to be heard, not the way it actually sounded. Does that make any sense?
Oh, I dig it. I dig. Keep going. I dig, man. I really dig.
Okay, here I'll give you an example. There's been nights when I was stoned on acid and I thought the music was from Mars or from outer space, the most incredible, beautiful stuff I ever heard. Next day I'd listen back to the tape and it sounded like garbage cans rolling down flights of stairs.
Right.
So there you go. I mean, it's really subjective, but so LSD is definitely a dream. And that's all it really is. But along the process of repeated taking it, it also creates changes in you, in each of us psychologically. And so some of the changes are good, some are not. If I had it to do over again, I'm not sure I would. But at the same time, that's sort of a moot point because I did it, and I don't have it to do over again. And it was what it was. And I think that for the most part, most of us tried to make the best of it that we can. And I think that the ones of us that are still around today are trying to make the best of it that we can. But it was certainly, how does the saying go? A long, strange trip.
Well, I mean, going back to Pig. I mean, Pigpen does. You talk about him. It was his band, no doubt. He was the leader of the band when he was alive.
I wouldn't say he was the leader of the band, but he was the most experienced player in the band, and he had the most music background. But he came from, his dad was a disc jockey for a rhythm and blues station
in Palo Alto. Yeah, absolutely, East Palo Alto.
And there's a station called KSOL, K-Soul. His dad was a disc jockey on it. And so he grew up listening to rhythm and blues music from the 50s. And so that was kind of his background, and he could sing and play that stuff and play harmonica all night long. I mean, I still do Jimmy Reed songs that I learned from Pigpen, and Lightning Hopkins songs that I learned from Pigpen. That was whenever the Bicycle or Healey Treese Band played those kind of songs, Willie and the Hand Jive. I got it from those guys.
Right.
And it was just another one of those songs. Hey, I know this song. Let's do it. No one else was doing it, and it was a nice groove, and so we decided to do it. So that's kind of the what you hear in your head, and compared to what it really is in the cold light of day, so to speak, is the difference with psychedelic drugs. So we heard that, and that was once you hear that. It's like knowing a truth. You can't unknow it, And so we tended to pursue, and the object was to see if we could pull it out and do it anytime we wanted, with or without drugs. Okay. And that was certainly enough of a challenge. Okay.
Well, I mean, just having a ball here. I wanted to ask you, Healy,
as far as I'm concerned, let me just say this.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, the Grateful Dead actually we pulled it off. We actually learned to do it.
Well,
anyway,
you know what I want you to just if this is interesting because you made it very clear. It was sort of, you know, the music at first was sort of, I don't know what the right word is, but it wasn't necessarily listenable. And then by the 70s, like you said, people started to listen to the music, right? They started to really get it, right? And eventually
first of all, we started to learn how to do it.
Well, I'm curious as to how psychedelics played a role in growing the music from being, I don't want to say noise, but eventually into music. Like that to me is inspiring because you're right. I mean, you talk to any of the Ben Sidran or the cats from Steve Miller Band, they would say, you know, the guys a couple of guys in the Grateful Dead weren't even musicians when they started the band, you know. But
That's
eventually,
right.
over time, it became listenable. And by my favorite period of time, which is bizarre, is the early '80s. I mean, they were a ferocious, stoned bunch of truck drivers driving down the highway, but it was ferocious music, and to me, it was very listenable. But I'm just wondering about psychedelics and how if in fact that crusade of sorts helped make the music more listenable.
Well, what it is that, remember referring back a minute ago when I said the music we heard in our heads, it was flawless because it was performed flawlessly. But when it came to us playing it, it wasn't quite so flawless because we weren't that good at playing. But as we learned to play and learned the craft of our instruments, then we began to get closer and closer and closer to the music in our head. So the music we heard in our head was harmonious and beautiful and fit together and interlinked and meshed and complemented each other, and so it was pure harmony, and not in the not in the hokey sense, but in the sort of combinational senses, and so all we needed to do is learn how to make it actually sound like that, and I guess that was probably you'd say that's the definition of what we were up to and how and what motivated us and what drove us along the way. And like I said, it got to by the end of by the year 2000. The Grateful Dead had done it. There's been nights at Madison Square Garden, and just to name one of many, and that I heard the true consummate Grateful Dead, and people that were there will know it. If you were there, it's like Paul Simon's song Kodachrome. If you saw it in Living Color, you know it.
Right. It's that idea of once you see and know the truth, it's a truth. What year? I'm sorry, you said 2000. What year?
Well, Grateful Dead got good in the 80s,
big time,
and all through the 90s. Okay. And then the vicissitudes of life began to take away from it and stuff, you know. But it was the 80s and 90s there were sterling years of sterling performances, just staggering, hair-raising performance. We also had Candace Brightman was probably very likely the most fantastic, greatest lighting director that ever walked the face of the earth. So the Grateful Dead had the best lights and the best sound, and there's been times when Candace and I and the band would collaborate and mesmerize the audience completely. And I've stood there where you could hear a pin drop between notes. Okay.
We've been cooking for an hour. Could we set up a set 2, or do you want to keep going?
I maybe a set 2 sometime. I got other things I got to do.
All right,
I'm already getting a flash here on my buzzer.
Okay, no, I was going to say I would love you to before I let you go. I just would love you to talk about the story about how you found Mike Larsheed, the bass player, to play.
Richard Treat found him.
No. But this is after Donna Keith, okay? And you had
Right.
Keith was playing bass.
Keith was playing keyboard. The Larch was playing bass.
But okay, this is going back. Let me just try to. You and Billy were sitting in a hotel room in the Uptown Theater playing Chicago, and you said, because at the time Godchow was playing bass, and you were like, "Where the heck is Larsheed?" And then you wound up getting a phone call from him. I don't want to tell you this. You don't remember this story?
I only vaguely.
So I mean, I guess here's the better question. Can you talk about listen, I've interviewed Greg Arico, I've interviewed David Garibaldi multiple times, Michael Shreve, on and on and on, Dave Getz. Haven't gotten to Billy yet. I'd like you to just talk to the audience about Billy Kreutzmann's drumming style and really the first time you had a chance to play with Billy, because I think it probably dates back to that, I don't know. I just want you to talk about his style. What made him such an incredibly good drummer?
I think his stamina, for one thing, and the fact that he didn't always know it about himself, but he was a natural drummer. But one of the things that was really plaguing, like he wasn't really a drummer until he joined the Grateful Dead. So he's one of the ones that learned to play. But he had a natural sense. It took him a bunch of years to get it together, but once he did, you could get him to relax, he played good. He was one of my favorite. He still is. I mean, we had Butch Giannini, who was by far the best. But next to him, Kreutzmann was probably. I would play with Kreutzmann at the drop of a hat anytime.
What makes him such a fluid? And first of all, I didn't realize. I thought he was. Well, he took lessons from a cat on Perry Lane, but he was not a drummer when he joined.
Well, yeah, he was. Maybe I didn't mean that literally. I meant he was a beginner. I'll put it like that.
Right, and then but in terms of, because a lot of people will get on and say, it's not perfection, it's kind of sloppy. But for me, it's like, I don't know, he just has this ability to swing so hard. But
that's for me. I'll tell you what Billy is. He's like your favorite old pair of shoes. Okay, they feel good on your feet. All right, your favorite jacket. It feels good wrapped around you. Playing with Billy makes me relax and enjoy playing music. He doesn't push you forward and he doesn't hold you back, and he has no sense of being of superiority or any of that bullshit stuff. So he's like a comfy player, and he, with a great sense of humor. All right, and that's the kind of stuff that makes fun to play music with. I'll give you a little anecdote. One time, we were at a little nightclub in New York City called The Other End.
Sure.
And we were playing along, and for some reason, Billy just got bored, and we were doing one of those crazy things with the Healy Trees band would do, which is we would sometimes put down our instruments and just start singing a cappella and clapping our hands and doing weird shit, playing rhythm shaking instruments and stuff. Billy got some spoons, and you ever heard people play spoons?
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
All right. Well, you put two spoons between your finger, your index finger, and your ring finger, and side by side, and then you whack them on your knee, and it makes a clicking sound.
Absolutely.
It's called playing spoons. So you put your hand above it and your knee below it, so you can have a up click, and a down click. He did this spoon solo that right now I got goosebumps just thinking of remembering it, and just stuff like that. Now you show me a drummer that got the balls to do that, okay?
And the point is, it was still swinging really hard, even though he was playing this.
It was ass fucking kicking,
man. Oh my God! No, because I tell you, man, there's a couple of shows. First of all, I am so glad that I did some research, but this is going back to Larry Klein. I totally thought, I was like, dude, I'm like, how the heck did Healy know? I'm thinking it's the Larry Klein that was Joni Mitchell's husband, the badass jazz player, but it was not. Yeah. It was a different Larry Klein. But you listen to some of these shows that are out there, not great audience recordings, but some of the space jams that you get off in, I've never heard Billy playing like that in my life, ever.
He liked it because he was free from any of the regiments of the Grateful Dead and stuff. It's the same reason Garcia had his own band, same reason all of us had our own bands. Because the Grateful Dead by then, by the 80s, there was a certain expectation. First of all, we had 30-some-odd people on the payroll, so business had to go on. The office had to run. Records had to be made because we had signed commitment contracts to make records. And so we had mouths to feed, and when we had an audience to take care of and a responsibility to show up and play and not let anything happen untoward to our audiences and stuff. So there was a whole side of the Grateful Dead, and not just the Grateful Dead, but any organization, any band that is responsible. You can't just be carefree kids anymore. I mean, you have to pay attention. You don't want someone getting hurt at your concert. You don't want stupid things happening. So it got to be. There was the work side of it as well as the fun side of it. It wasn't always just fun. fun is for a couple hours when you're on stage. That's when the fun starts and ends there. The rest of the time, it's fingernails on the chalkboard plus a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So when we had our own little side bands, it was an opportunity to go back in time, like the Grateful Dead was way back when we were all kids and first starting out, without all the attachment of all the responsibilities and stuff. Okay, and so once you do that, it tends to influence how you play. So he had a much easier groove going because he could afford to do it without having a lot of responsibility. It was just there for fun, and none of us were really making any money doing it. We were living because of our Grateful Dead money. But so this was an opportunity to go out and experiment and have fun, so to go back to the beginning, so to speak. All right.
Dan Healy, it was an honor. I hope you had a ball. I really did, man. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Okay, buddy.
Later, in. Dan Healy, sound engineer, genius, and also a musician, badass musician in his own right. We'll be back momentarily with Alfred Roberts on the Jake Feinberg Show right after this.